Today, I will be continuing on with a series of videos about pattern design for leather projects using CAD. I will show how to design and insert stitching holes, how to best lay out these stitching holes so that they are evenly spaced, and how to match your T-pocket height with your chisel spacing. I will be using NanoCAD as a CAD software to demonstrate. However, all the commands that I use here will also apply to AutoCAD, both of which are great software for doing any kind of design work. I have left links on where you can find these software in the video description. Now, let's get started. Putting stitching holes into a pattern can help you lay out all of your stitching holes evenly, so you can create projects with very clean looking stitches. Before we can insert stitching holes into CAD, we need to get the dimensions of the stitching chisels that we plan to use. Here I will be using my Cinnabrooks pricking irons with 3.38mm spacing. We can get the angle of the teeth by punching in a row of stitching holes just above a line marked on a paper. Then we can draw in an extension of one of the angled stitching holes, and then measure the angle of the line using a protractor. And here we get 45 degrees. Most pricking irons will be around 45 degrees, but some will be less, like these Crimson Hide Japanese style pricking irons, which have an angle of only 30 degrees. Next, we need to confirm the hole spacing, which I can do by measuring off these 11 stitching holes. These are exactly as specified at 3.38mm spacing. And then for the prong width, which I can measure with my thickness gauge at 2.2mm. Now let's put all of these details into CAD. I will be applying the stitching holes to this simple card holder design. The first step is to put in the center line of the stitches. I like to use a 3mm stitching line and can insert it by using the offset command and entering 3 and offsetting the edges. Then I will restyle the stitching line to differentiate it from the pattern outline. Next, I can draw in a stitch the same dimensions as my chisel using the line command. Click on the starting point, then press the @ key followed by the length of the stitch of 2.2mm, followed by the less than symbol and the angle of the stitch of 45 degrees, and then hit enter. This gives me a single stitch which I can then space out according to the stitching spacing. Select the stitch and use the COPYBASE command. Then select the displacement point 3.38mm to the left of the top of the stitch. Then proceed to paste new stitches that are 3.3mm away from the top of the previous stitch. Then you can select a larger group of stitches and again copy and paste using a base point. I can then select the stitches I have created and use the move function to center them on the stitching line. If you are using Japanese style chisels, like these Crimson Hide irons with pointed tips, it is a lot easier to insert stitching holes as you only need to mark in the hole centers in your pattern. You can simply use a small circle to mark the center of the holes, rather than using slanted stitching marks. It then becomes very easy to line up the points of your chisel and punch in your holes. To get the stitches for the vertical section of the card holder, I can select a group of them and use the rotate function to rotate them 90 degrees. Then use the move function to position them centered on the vertical line. When it comes to the corners of stitching lines, there are a few ways to approach them. You can extend one of the stitching lines into the corner, or use a diamond awl angled halfway, or even make a round hole with a round awl. Whatever you choose, you should only be making a single hole which is centered on the X where both the stitching lines meet. To make the stitching lines meet at the corner, I can move both groups of stitches so that they meet at an X at the very corner. The next step is to lay out the stitches so that they are spread evenly between the corners of the edge of the project. As a general rule, if you are unable to get all your stitches evenly spaced, you should remove one stitching hole and make some stitches wider spaced, because short stitches tend to look more noticeable. The easiest method to lay out the stitches is to have the stitches in the middle of the edge evenly spaced, and then have the two stitches right next to each corner with a slightly longer spacing, where they will be almost unnoticeable. An alternative method is to make the length of your edges match with the spacing of your chisel holes. This is the method that I use for my projects, but it does require more planning and more design time. For this card holder design, if I can change the width of the card holder slightly, I will be able to make the spacing of the last stitch in the corner the same spacing as all the rest. To do this, I will select the entire side edge, including the stitching line and stitches, and move them so the two stitching lines meet perfectly in the corner. Then I can simply fix up the outlines on the top and bottom, and now the bottom edge has perfectly spaced stitching holes. If you repeat this process with all your edges, you can create perfect looking stitching throughout your project. It also makes it very easy if you want to use a stitching method where you chisel both pieces of a project separately, as the evenly spaced holes will automatically align with each other. The next area where stitching holes are very important is around T-pockets when you're making a wallet. If your stitching holes are not spaced well, they will clip the edge of the leather around your T-pockets and make it so the stitches do not lay cleanly within the holes. The best way to lay your stitches around the T-pockets is to have your stitches sit above and below the leather edge, with the edge in the center between each stitching hole. The way to design this is by setting the height of the T-pockets equal to a multiple of the stitching spacing. T-pockets are normally around 10 mm high, so we should select a stitching height near to that. For these 3.38 mm spacing irons, I can set a height of 10.14 mm, which is the length of 3 stitches. If I was using a 4 mm spacing chisel, a height of 8 mm or 12 mm would work well. In CAD, it is just a matter of moving the tops of your T-pockets so that they are centered between two stitching holes, and then in my case, setting the next T-pocket 3 stitches away. This spacing of 3 stitches makes the T-pocket height equal to 10.14 mm, which will make the prongs of my chisel sit perfectly between the edges. This method works well for large and medium stitching hole spacing. However, if you try this with small stitching spacing, such as 2.7 mm, you will find it impractical when it comes to chiseling, as the gaps between the tips of the slanted stitching holes become very small. I will leave a link to the CAD file I have used in this video in the video description, where I have also linked other videos within this video series. For the next video on CAD design, I will look at how to set up multi-page patterns. If you have any questions relating to CAD or pattern making, feel free to leave it in the comment below. And if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.